American really. Rick is kind of getting done with me.
Good. So good. We just still got plenty of things.
Okay.
Yep, ready when you are.
Welcome to this meeting of the Central Otago District Council. It's a pleasure to have a full house of councillors today. Welcome to management and welcome to guests. We shall start the day with karakia, this time led by Councillor McPherson.
Sure. What to get to reach what karakia. Karakia chi tomato echo. I to be apple. It's after the chill, my movie. Even after near movie culture. Watching battery. It's life. After half of the flagship, we need to build with pitch. What is the most important thing in this world? I tell you, it is the people.
As I've said, we've had no apologies today, which moves us through to the public forum. First expected people for public forum were Janet Lucas and Brian McCutcheon. Unfortunately,
They might be here.
they may be here, but what we'll do is, Ken, can you fire away, please? You have 5 minutes. You know the drill. Welcome.
I'm greeting talk. I'm a sign out here and I'm down as a wicket. Family board was set up way back in 1989. By the title of this, what I'm talking about is PODC versus Community Board. Community Board was set up way back in 1989, I believe. The purpose was for there to be a greater connection, engagement and involvement with local communities, unfettered and autonomous with decision making. At the last VCB meeting by a democratic majority vote, it was decided to stage the tree removal at the Half Mile Reserve. After interference and muddying the waters by the Mayor and the CEO in some rewording of a resolution, it was, by majority, decided to ask the council if staged removal was in breach of the COBC wild and conifer policy. The specific wording included the word breach. Now, when the report came out that's before you, under the heading purpose of the report, the word breach has been exchanged for consistent with. While that may appear to be pedantic to some, it highlights that paid staff don't listen or read to what they have been tasked to do. The report that you are considering is today says that legal advice has been sought and incorporated into it. I can't find a legal opinion anywhere in this report, or who the legal practitioner may be, or what company undertook that work. If the legal opinion exists and clearly demonstrates that staging is in breach of the wild and pine policy, then there would be no need whatsoever for reams of paper as is before you on your agenda today. The Bridge Hill residents clearly wanted either retention or stage. They made it very clear in the biased survey back in June. VCB settled on stage, but this council are about to vote on recommendations that clearly trample all over the wishes of both the majority of the VCB members and the communities. To rub salt into the wound, the recommendation C is to alter the wilding policy so as to make any staging a breach of the VCB decision to stage. If the present policy, wilding policy, does exclude staging, then why in recommendation C is it necessary to prohibit staging? People need to figure that one out. If the lower Manaboo Reserve Stage eradication has been underway for a long time. Not once has that been deemed to breach the wilding eradication policy. The VCB decision is about removing the pines, just on a different time frame, and is actually proactive. At the meeting, or at that VCB meeting, it was never agreed or discussed on the 3-year maximum staging. As everyone knows, that short time frame is never enough to assess the success of mating seedlings, especially without water. And in fact, it was a 7/10-year discussion. For this council to vote away the VCB democratic decision is just plain undemocratic and very, very wrong. Yes.
Thank you, Ken. Any questions, councillors? Lynn?
Consider on the case by the.
Absolutely simple. What this council has failed to do over 20 years is to have management and reserve management plans under the Reserves Act. And if they had done that, which was their legal obligation, each single reserve could have covered this. At the moment, trying to retrofit the wilding policy, wilding fine policy, to fit at this stage, one reserve, which is the heart one. So it's quite simple. Create a, it's so simple to me. Might be things I don't know. But when you have legislation like the Reserves Act and you don't follow it, you're fighting in the bum in the end. So it would be quite simple. The policy that was created in a big hurry back in July last year, without public consultation, that got voted down. No, it doesn't need to cover specific issues. Just that's all that you get, and it doesn't breach. What the basically done. There's no breach there whatsoever. It's plain worded. Plain words have plain meanings under law. I'll be quite honest. It's an absolute affront to the VCB members. Have this thing got back today.
You've gone off. Ken, you've gone off the question. And going back to your topic. Any other questions, councillors? Thank you, Ken. Thank you. Appreciate your time. Our next speakers, Janet Lucas and Brian McCutcheon. Brian, I don't see Janet. Is she coming?
No, sorry, apologies.
No worries. Come on up.
Not actually sure that we were speaking either. I thought we were observing.
Oh, well, you can do either. We had you down as a speaker.
Janet
Definitely said she wanted to speak.
Right, okay.
But if you don't,
No, right, I think we know what's been discussed today, so we'll watch with interest.
okay, your paper is not due till 12 o'clock, unfortunately.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, right, thank you. Right, that will then move us to the confirmation of the minutes of our last meeting on the 25th of January. Somebody there wants to move the true and correct record? Thank you, Tamer. Seconded Ian. Thank you. Any discussion? All those in favour? Aye. Against? Carried. Moving us through to our declarations of interest, which you will find on page, I'm still getting used to this new system, page 17. And just a reminder to folks to just occasionally have a look at those, because I had a look at mine and realised there was quite a number that somehow mysteriously dropped off of my council appointments. So they are getting sorted, and always remove yourself from matters that may create a real or perceived conflict. Next, we welcome to join us Susan Freeman-Green, the CEO of Local Government New Zealand. Susan, welcome to the table. Thank you so much for travelling down to join us today. This is going to be a discussion on council mark and other matters that LGNZ have at hand, and then questions from councillors. Stuart was, President Stewart was going to be here, Stuart Crosby, but unfortunately unable to be. And when I asked Vice President Sam Broughton if he could come there in a council meeting today, so unable to do that as well. Ken, can I ask you to take your seat, please? Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Susan, floor is yours.
Thanks, and great to be here. And I'm sort of obviously we have yeah, been very much seriously the being the that's not only how local government. So someone needs to look after all of it. And we know that's been are we what we is as there, and we were able to get behind that.
Very much so.
And be able to create a wee campaign around that with match councils and all those things. So that's been, you know, being able to do that is really useful. We another thing we do that you would always see is we provide a lot of informal advice to elected members from around the Motu when they, you know, have an issue or there are some challenges in a council. A lot of that goes under the radar, but that's another sort of form of support. We spend a lot of time on the sector development, and I'll come back to council mark, but that's not only council mark, but it's also, we've just launched a whole new program, Artona, which is, I hope councillors are having a look at it. It's brand new, it's evolving, we're at the early stages of it. It's free trial at the moment, and I think this week a whole lot of new modules have gone up, fresh modules, and that will just continue to evolve. And shortly we're about to start our art hours and a whole range of wellbeing workshops as well. Council Mark is another part of our sort of broader sector in development, governance work, and induction into a range of things around that. A large part of our work is in the policy and advocacy space, as you know, so that's our most recent work has been really getting under the bonnet of the three big pieces of reform that are on the table now. So looking at what's on the table, which is different from, you know, the government's agenda around reform, which is a different issue, but what's on the table, is it fit for purpose, why isn't it? And we've had some pretty strong submissions. We're really conscious of getting feedback from our members that goes into that, and also getting what we're hearing back to you as soon as possible, so that councils around the country can use as in parts of our submissions to inform or enable them to shortcut some of their submissions or tailor them. I mean, for example, Future for Local Government submission that went in, we've had some feedback from a couple of councils that they wouldn't have been able to do the piece of work. They've been able to pick it up, use parts and customise it according to their particular needs. So there's a lot of that kind of work that goes in the background, as well as our remits and, you know, some very specific bits of advocacy. So for example, in the vote campaign last year, we advocated quickly and strongly to get the residential addresses off the campaign material, so that counts, you know, so that candidates didn't put residential addresses on, have to, because of some of the safety issues. And we managed to get that through in time for the election. We do a lot of work on government relations. That's an absolute priority for our National Council to really think about engagement, not just with the government, but with all parties. That's pretty critical. And we've got in developing a comprehensive government relations strategy on that, as well as other stakeholders. The media is quite key, being able to, you know, join the dots between a submission or an advocacy position and getting a story pitched into the media on it is something that is a service we offer. Our members have access to that service. We saw that last week with, you know, near Tim said, okay, I've got this idea, we all got behind it, and then we were able to make a large part of that was getting some media interviews, came up for the day to do that, right? So, you know, being able to be agile and pivot in these places is something that we think about a lot. And of course, really key, and one of the things that our members tell us they find the most valuable is our networks, and being able to bring together members in different sector groups, whether it's rural and provincial or metros, our young elected members, community boards, Te Rawata, which is our elected members network, and a good portion of our time is spent pulling those groups together and working with the various chairs to set agendas and to get the right kind of speakers and get politicians into the room to speak at those. And a very, you know, in terms of that sort of stewardship of local government and making sure that, you know, central government sees local government as not just another sector, but a partner, another tier of government. The public storytelling is really important, so we're focusing on that as well. So that's just a real quick overview on some of the things we do that mightn't always be visible in terms of how we support our members. Council Mark has been part of our thinking in terms of is it fit for purpose and how do we evolve it. We went, so have you ever done Council Mark?
No.
No. So it is a really rigorous independent assessment of a council, and you will know that it provides a rating that can be benchmarked. When it was set up in 2017, when the thinking first happened, the idea behind Council Mark was to show the public that councils were really, you know, good at what they do. In fact, when we've started doing council mark assessments, we've had a real range of results. But what we have found and what our constant feedback from councils has been is that really the value in it is as a sort of tool for improvement. And recently, last year, we did some research with our members and our councils about Council Mark. We said, what for those who participated, those who don't want to participate. We also talked to Tai Tuara, which is the, Sandra's the president of, as you know, is the professionals membership body. So we did a big 360 type review of Council Mark with an independent research company, and we had heard consistently from everyone was that there were three main issues with Council Mark. One is that it was used often in a kind of weaponized way. So it was often used, without a proportionate kind of response. It was used as a way to either, point the finger at management or point the finger at elected members, or to create some, noise in a system. And councils told us that they didn't find that helpful. They really found the helpful piece being around the continuous improvement. Another challenge that we were constantly told about is there was a massive amount of work. The workload it places on staff in particular is really full on. So that what people liked was the fact that there was a sort of rigor and some independence in the assessment. But the third piece that people said that was the problem with it is that you get this report, you get this assessment, and then what? Like, how do you take the steps to improve, other than getting consultants or thinking about it internally? But actually, what's your path? Where can you learn from each other? How can you have shared learnings from other councils? So our team has been looking at an evolved Council Mark and is close to launching it, close to talking about it, and close to being able to share it. So this is just a little bit of a sneak preview from me, and it's going to look at a phasing approach. So it will retain the rigor. So there will still be a benchmarking exercise, but it might be that a council who chooses to focus on one particular quadruple area of Council Mark as opposed to another. So whether it's the asset management or governance or whatever it is, so you might want to start with that. It will provide a different kind of report that has a lot more, that gives a sort of overview of areas of focus, so like a coloured graph type report, and it can then you can dive deeply into it, so it'll provide more insights, but in a focused kind of way. And it's the thinking behind Council Mark is that it will change the workload, so it will enable you to work on areas that council decides are most important. So, and the focus on using it as a reputation tool as opposed to a continuous improvement tool will dial down, because that's not being helpful in a reasonable sense, which is what the important aspect is. So we'll have more detail to share about that soon. That's looking to go live in June, so not that far away. If you're thinking about Council Mark seriously around this table, I would probably suggest that you invite Elka, who's looking after that program, to come and talk to you by Zoom at a meeting to think about the next stages there. But that's kind of an overview of what we're doing with that for now. I'm open to questions on the full extent of what I've shared.
Brilliant. Thank you, Susan. Questions, councillors? Tracy.
Just when you said changing the workload, can you expand on that a little bit? How you see that happening?
So at the moment, there's a full holistic review of every aspect of the performance of the council and council mark. And there are segments to that. So you might be able to choose a segment to look at, you know, so of course, you know, performance depends on the whole, but you might want it, you might have an area that you think you're particularly concerned about, so you might want to focus on that. So you can do that, and then you can do the next one from there. So you can actually change and phase the way you work through council in a much more sort of engaged, interactive way, rather than just, you know, so we're thinking about how we do that. But that is the idea, that it is actually to service, not just a judging mechanism.
In terms of LGNZ's support for the more rural, smaller councils like ours, what are the biggest challenges for you at the moment in supporting smaller players in the region?
Look, it's a really important thing that we do is support them. But there's a very broad range of needs in our rural and provincial areas, if you think from the far north right down. So it is interesting when we get together, as we did last week, it was only last week in the rural and provincial sector meeting, and ask our rural and provincial elected members what their priorities are, how actually a lot of them are very strongly aligned around things like connectivity and transport and climate. So from that point of view, it isn't too difficult, but the challenges, you know, come in some of the really gnarly political issues around Three Waters, for example, when, you know, there's a very strong diversity of views around water, which I think is actually just something we need to accept. The engagement piece is harder for us. So how do we get to, how do we communicate? How do we have these conversations around every table? Is a challenge for our team, but it's something we're committed to.
I might be able to add to that because Susan will probably be too modest to do so. But at National Council last week, we had Craig of Wairau call in by Zoom, and he obviously is in the middle of ground zero essentially. And he did comment on how when they finally got connectivity after about 3 days or something ridiculous, they managed to get a Starlink phone in. He had 15 minutes on the Starlink phone because everyone else wanted it. And so he had a list and he rang Susan and said, I need you to do this, which included get hold of the Prime Minister. I think it went all the way to the top and tell him this, etc., etc. So it can be as much as that, who you're going to call. And when you're part of a national body like this, would have been rather useful. He was very pleased.
Yeah.
Because those things came through. He said the team made it happen.
Yeah, and I think in that context, you know, I texted him and said, you know, anything we can do to help. So he got that text at just the time he had his link, and and that was, you know, that's really important for us to be able to do that and to build the relationships with all our leaders. I'm pretty focused on that.
Other questions, councillors?
Yeah, may just be me, but some of us got the feeling that the local government, New Zealand on the Three Waters debate, it was obviously quite a hot topic, but felt that local government New Zealand was just following Crown or the government of the time, at the time, same government, was just doing lip service to the government. And clearly a lot of councils felt completely contrary to the debate. Do you feel, or is there that much political pressure to toe the party line?
Look, absolutely zero political pressure to toe the party line. What we've committed to at Local Government New Zealand, what National Council is committed to, is outcome focused, make sure if something's on the table, that's the government's reform. If it's going to happen, let's make it as good as it can be from a local government perspective, to make it as workable and as good as it can be. What we didn't do well, which we've talked about a lot and apologise for, is in the lead up to the government making its decision. That was what, July 2 years ago, around making it mandatory for entity model and all the rest of it. What we didn't do well, because we've got lots of pressure from local government to actually make sure that if anything happens, you know, you're well placed, that you know, like the deal is as good as it can possibly be. What we hadn't done very well, which is where all the issues converged on the piece of agreement, was communicate, take local government councils members with us. And so that's, you know, we've put our hand up for that, but actually, you know, the focus, the point was in, you know, like, we've got to be around the table. It's really, really bad if you're not around the table. The government can do whatever they want. But, you know, we absolutely made it also 100% clear that the sector was not happy with the model. Even in that negotiation, we said it's not nearly enough local influence, no local voice in this model. We haven't resolved that. The governance and accountability piece was really murky, which was the catalyst for the working group, but again, the Tim was on. We never agreed with the model. We never got political pressure to agree with the model. What we did was think, right, you know, it's part of our job is to make sure that whatever happens is as viable as it can be. But it's very difficult because it's a really political situation. Yeah.
It still is.
And it still is. And, you know, like, it's still uncertain and, yeah.
Some of our ratepayers have suggested that we undertake a council mark review. Do you think the new version will give them the same comfort that we're performing well?
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
In terms of that, Susan, next year, so the June, July, the new Council Mark 2 will come out, which would mean if we were to embark on that, we're basically right in an LTP year, which is also going to be potentially a double LTP year, because we have to figure out what we do in terms of what happens in October. With the reframing in terms of workload, and obviously I'm going to say you're a salesperson, you're an advocate for Council Mark.
Yeah.
Can you see that even under the new model, under an organisation with the pressures that an LTP year brings, that might not be an ideal time for this?
I think I hear you. I think it is. I think part of the design of the new Council Mark has been to make it as easy as possible. So what I would suggest is that you engage with Elka on this if you're seriously thinking about it, and see what the plan is and work out the timing. A couple of councils who have had questions about it have thought, okay, now it's a bit more doable with this potential model. So that's what I would really suggest. And she'll be in a good, and that's just thinking they're holding off till they know more about it, but they haven't written it off in the same way they had written it off for that reason.
Brilliant. Any further questions, councillors? Susan, are you around to join us for lunch if we were to find you an office to work from, or are you having to get the plane?
I'll just double check my bank. I think it's about 4.
Oh, easy.
Yeah.
Well, we're at lunch at 12:30, and I'm sure somebody can find an office like the CEO's palace or.
My main issue being here, having got here, is that I'm not supposed to be in the car park. I got told off.
We're pretty lax in enforcement. Ultimately, lax.
It's like you're not
I
in
got
problem.
quite told off.
We can sort that out. The lunch today is actually special lunch was a fundraiser for Central Hawke's Bay as part of.
Oh, amazing.
The Algae initiative.
Yeah.
$18.
Just one thing about getting to Queenstown with roadworks at the moment. I know a number of people have missed flights by losing an hour to get there, so whatever it's going to take in an hour.
Right,
Okay,
All right.
I can give you a chance.
Okay.
brilliant. Thank you so much, Susan. Greatly appreciate it. Look forward to seeing you at lunchtime. Thanks. Right, we now come to the next item on our agenda, Otago Museum's draft annual plan, and that is your item, Tanya. I'll leave it with you.
Wonderful. Down to the presentation page. And welcome to Rebecca Williams and Ian Griffin from Otago.
Thank you, and thank you, councillors. Wayne's just putting a presentation up that Ian's going to speak to. But before he does, I might just start with some opening comments. So, as you know from my report, CODC funds an annual levy to Otago Museum is set out in the Otago Museum Trust Fund Act, which is legislation from gone by. As you will see from my report and the presentation that you're about to see from Ian, the value for money that we receive for the investment that we contribute to Otago Museum is very much value for money. The Otago Museum is requesting an increase of 7%, and in my report, I'm suggesting that that's probably not unreasonable given the current rate of inflation. However, my report then notes that we haven't got that in existing budgets, being $1,607 shy, and would need to have a think about where that might be funded from. So with those opening comments, I'll hand over to Ian just to run through his presentation and then respond to any questions if that's okay. Yeah.
Okay, sure, thank you. Can I drive?
Can you drive it?
Yep. Yeah, across there. I did not was allowed to touch council property, so. Yeah. Kia ora koutou. My name's Ian Griffin. I am the director of the Otago Museum. It's always a pleasure to come and face councils to look you in the eyes because we can appreciate the funding we get from ratepayers. It is terribly important in terms of running our institution. We're now called Tūhura Otago Museum. Last year we were gifted the name Tūhura by Madam Anua, and in some of the presentation today you will see the word Tūhura, and it's a word that means to rise up, to discover, to find out, and it's very appropriate, or to enlighten is another meaning which is very appropriate when you consider what the museum tries to do. Anyway, I've only got 5 minutes, so I'll be brief. I recognise there may well be some new councillors who may not know the story of the Otago Museum. We were founded in 1868, a year before the University of Otago, and we've been working in across Otago and across Otago and Southland for more than 150 years. As Rebecca mentioned, we're one of the 4 major metropolitans in the country, the other being Te Papa, the Auckland Museum, the Canterbury Museum, and each of us have our own Act of Parliament, which controls the way that we're funded, and now since the 1996 Otago Museum Act. And that under that act, that defines why we should, or how we should be funded by Community City Council, Clutha, and Central Otago. We've got more than 1.5 million objects in our collection. And I understand some of you may well be coming to Dunedin in a while, and we're going to take you on a tour and show you some of the stuff we've got. It's a marvellous treasure house. And the objects range in scale from whales to tiny mosquitoes, incredible Maori collections, material from across the planet. Dunedin was a wealthy place back in the past, and the people who lived there donated really amazing stuff to our museum, and that's why we've got one of the best collections in the world. We are also a major tourist attraction, and I'll talk about this later. We are a significant contributor to the Otago economy. We also provide educational experiences to schools from across Otago and Southland, and we're also one of the top performing museums we have to be when it comes to self-generating income, because that's critical to our business model. So what did we do for you last year? I called up some stuff, some facts and figures from the team. In our most recent survey, which we ran over the Christmas period, 3% of our visitors came from Central, which if you average out over our visitor numbers during the course of the year, that's about 8,000 people came from Central to our museum. We hosted 268 students from Central Otago schools for sleepovers. These numbers are a little down on previous years because of the whole COVID impact. Our outreach team engaged 1,434 residents of the district. They're the people who come in lab in a box or go to the AMP shows and basically kind of do cool science experiments or bring cultural material for kids to look at. We run two MCH funded projects, one called Tutonu and one called Hidden Hazards. And they are projects which allow us to support other museums in the Otago and Southland area. And that team has engaged every single museum in this district over the last year. And our collections team provide ongoing care and conservation for tens of thousands of items which come from this part of the world, including, of course, the Noah footprints, which our team led the recovery of from the Clyburn River back in 2019, which was an extraordinary project. We commissioned a study by Martin Jenkins. It's an independent study, and incredibly, the economic impact, you might find it incredible, I find it extraordinary. We have roughly the same economic impact on the region as the Forsyth Park Stadium. We employ over 100 staff. We get, on a pre-COVID year, 350,000 visitors. That generates a number of bed nights in the Otago region. And we also, of course, support companies across Otago and Southland. So we are an institution that does have significant economic impact. And this independent study by Martin Jenkins says that for every dollar of public funding we get, there's a return of $5.90. So it is good value, and that's just economics. There are some challenges, and this is one of the things I'd like to talk to you about. We have a massive collection, which is at the same scale as that of the Auckland, Canterbury, and Te Papa museums. And yet we're funding that on a ratepayer base, which is tiny. The wealth of our collection is way out of proportion to the ability of our ratepayers to be able to support it in an appropriate way. And we try really hard to offset the costs. And there are some charts here which you might be able to see, which show the actual amount of funding that each institution gets. So Te Papa on the left gets a significant amount of taxpayer funding. The Auckland Museum and the Canterbury Museum get a significant amount of local ratepayer funding, and we function on roughly, the smallest amount of ratepayer funding of the lot. And yet we've still got the same responsibility to look after this important collection. So we also generate, you can see, roughly only 49% of our funding last year came from the public purse. The rest of it came from other sources and generated nearly 30% last year from our commercial activities. Without that money, we wouldn't be able to have a collections team that's grown from 4 people to 10 people in the last 10 years. And COVID has really impacted us because of our business model. We rely on visitors paying entry fees and selling events and conferences. That's significantly impacted, and you can see in the next chart the downturn in income due to the COVID impact. So we think there is a strong argument that we're a special case, and we would like to try and secure national funding to support some of our activity. And we're seeking support for all the councils to write letters for that, because we think that's something that is really important and is particularly important for our institution. We're asking for a 7% increase this year, simply because our costs have increased massively. We are a living wage employer. The living wage has gone up significantly in the last couple of years. Our insurance bill has gone up by more than $150,000 in the last couple of years. These costs are all adding up. And you can see that the levy costs over the last 10 years, I've been director 10 years, the levy costs have never kept pace with inflation. In fact, we had about a 5 or 6 year period when we got no increase from anybody. So what do we do for you? For the $32,000, I think you do see quite a good return. And through some of our efforts, we get to do things like this. During my time, we've had 3 NASA astronauts visiting Central Otago, and they've not just been sightseeing, they've gone to schools and given talks in Ranfurly, Alexandra, and elsewhere. So my message really is, I believe the Otago Museum is good value for the ratepayers of Central Otago. I think we offer a critical service in supporting your museums. And also, when you do come and look at the treasures that we have, you'll see that we've got this responsibility to look after things like the Noah footprints, not just for 1 year, or for the next 200 years. And doing that isn't cheap, I'm afraid. It needs trained staff, and that's one of the reasons why, obviously, we try and employ as many of those. So I'm happy to answer any questions.
Can I just, sorry, mention one last thing before we ask questions, and that's the feedback from our museum network is overwhelmingly positive towards the support that they receive from the Otago Museum. And in particular, I want to mention Marissa, who has been our sort of contact person between the museum and the sector, and she's done an outstanding job, and she's unfortunately moving to the UK. So we're going to miss her dearly. We wish her very well on her journey. So I just wanted to not let that opportunity pass through.
Just in part, Nissa is our conservation manager, and she's been hired by the Victoria and Albert Museum. So we couldn't compete with that, I'm afraid, but it shows the quality of the people who've got working with us. And we're very proud of that.
Does anybody have any questions for Ian?
Yeah, I got one. In Auckland and Wellington, which the areas I don't know very well, is there any other museums apart from, apart from the Auckland Museum? Is there any local government funding to go into any museums there?
Well, in Auckland, the Auckland Museum is funded by ratepayers.
Oh, I thought
so. Te Apapa is the only one that's funded by taxpayers.
Oh, okay, I must have misread the graph.
Yeah, sorry.
But so I'll just say, from my question, Wellington, is there any ratepayer funded museums in Wellington?
Yeah, yes, there's the art gallery and the museum of what used to be called the Sea Museum, or Wellington, I think it's called Wellington Museum. And so there's a couple, yes.
We just made the observation, so they can pretty wrong. On the taxpayer, and Otago is not.
Yeah. So
I think there's a lot of what you're looking for support for some central government funding. It's attractive. Be surprised if we didn't support it.
I just had a couple of questions around looking through the report. Obviously, it's a really tough time for museums, both Otago and nationally and internationally, and it's difficult to generate those additional income streams. So aside from the lobbying force and funding from taxpayers as opposed to just ratepayers, what other things are in the pipeline for Otago?
Well, at some point, we're working on our reserves at the moment. And we burn about $300,000 a year. We've got about we've got reserves that are ring-fenced we can't spend. So people gave us things for coin collections, which we can only spend on coin collections. So we've got probably about 3 years before we, hit a roadblock. But before we do that, the only option we've got really, if there is no other funding option, is to reduce the number of staff, which will have an impact on our ability to look after things like the collection and stuff like that. We're always chasing money. We've got our science engagement team, which does a lot of work in schools. It's funded by grants, soft money, and we've been very successful in getting grants when they, competitive grants. So there's all. I've got to say, throughout my 10 years as a director, we've been 2 or 3 years away from hitting a wall, but it really is getting hard these days, particularly increasing the staffing costs.
And I saw there was obviously in the pipeline the potential to build a new storage facility. Yes. How does it work for museums? What's the appetite in the sector for the next 20, 30, 50 years on how much we keep and how much we don't?
Yeah. Well, we've actually purchased a site in Dunedin for an off-site store, which is above, it's on rock and above sea level. Because so if you did the same class they had in Nelson, we would lose our entire collection because it's in the basement of the museum and beneath is a flood zone. Now they've done some great flood works there, but that's the kind of danger. So our board decided the number one priority for us is to make sure the collection is safe. And the easiest way to do that is to build an off-site store. Now the site we've bought is potentially developable in partnership with others. There are other institutions, both in Dunedin and elsewhere in Otago, but maybe even Southland, that need storage. And if we could partner with maybe Heritage New Zealand or the University of Otago, which has also got Hocken collection and things like that, then we may be able to build a regional store that would keep everybody's important stuff safe in appropriate conditions in a way that could be easily accessed by the public. So from my perspective, that's a really big project that could be of regional importance that potentially could be funded nationally. And the benefit of having that is that it's not just us that benefits the store. We have conservation lab that everybody could use. It would have, a drive-in place. So when when we moved the mark footprints, for example, that was a really, really hard job to get them into our museum because we, you know, they were big and the museum wasn't really designed for it. So that's a priority for us, and talking to people, certainly in Dunedin, there is an appetite for some kind of regional facility that would benefit us all. You've got to remember that Dunedin itself is quite a relatively safe place when it comes to things like earthquakes and tsunamis. So again, that's a pitch to say we've got this nationally distributed collection. Maybe some of it could be stored in our part of the world as well. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes. Thank you.
Pretty long-winded, sorry.
Right, and considering you're running on tight finances, you're doing a wonderful job. It is a very enjoyable place to visit, especially with small people. You can fill a number of hours, which is great. So before us today are some recommendations. I've done the very important calculation on my phone and worked out that it would cost an extra 11 cents per property for the additional funding that is being sought. So on that, would somebody like to move recommendations A to D?
Probably that one's good.
Yes.
Can I suggest, I'm picking up what was suggested around the letter of support for Otago Museum for their fund, for their lobbying efforts in Wellington, and I just wondered if we wanted to add a resolution about a letter of support or just do it.
I do it anyway.
I don't think we need a resolution. I can do that as mayor. So I can,
I'll second that.
I'm just going to get to that. I'd like to move that motion, Tony, because I did a calculation, which is the increase is roughly 0.003%.
Okay.
Well,
So remember then, 'cause-
But they're not the same, it's one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Minimal. And Stu's the piece of.
Oh, sorry.
You might need to add to D though, as to where you're going to fund it. So I think it'll be just from, the general reserves.
Good point. Yeah, I'll agree with that, isn't it?
Because there's money that goes into that bucket from unspent other stuff, so that'll cover it, I would have thought. What, 11 cents?
Yeah. Point 11.
What,
There you go.
yeah.
I better not.
Thank you, Susan. So A to D has been moved by Tim, seconded by Stu. Thank you, Wayne. All those in favour?
Aye.
Against? Carried.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Before you runs away, can I ask him a quick question?
Yes, you can.
When is he going to put an app up which allows me to know when I can go out at night? When are you going to have an app which I can go out so I can tell them when the wars, it's like look at them?
It does a webpage.
Yeah, that's.
Yeah.
I prefer actually Wayne and Pete. It's a good time.
I went out looking for the Starlink, but it was cloudy.
Yeah.
It's always a problem.
Email me, I'll send you the list.
Thank you. We follow on to item 23.2.4, update on the district funding model for museum investment with Alex. Welcome, Alex and Dylan.
This report today from us is part of the wider work on museums that we're doing, but it's just a very small piece and really a small update to close the loop on the report that was commissioned by this table back in July. The intent of that report was to show the impact on different types of ratepayers and the different changes to our funding arrangements. And we're also going to just give you a very quick update on how we're using that report. Now, as I noted in my report about the report, there are a couple of changes in the data that we're going to go before the April report. And what we would like to do is to make sure we take all those questions back at once. So any questions from around this table as well as ours. There's just a lot of variability in data and a lot of costs associated with changing it. So we've made the decision to use our resources as best we can, have one go at getting it as refined as we're going to do it. But we really see this report as a tool rather than something to spend all our finance team's time on. Even without making those updates, though, this report does what it sets out to do. It provides us with the overall picture and how the impacts are felt, and it's assisted us in developing the options for consideration we'll bring to you in April. As you'll see, there were 3 options analysed: the status quo, the distributisation of all museum expenses, and the distributisation of grants and activity funding only, with property decisions remaining within the ward delegation. And there's a number of other criteria we need to apply to all of those factors as well. And this report really effectively rules out option 2 of that full distributisation of all activity. it would effectively restrict the use of those properties as only museum properties because they'd be the only properties we've moved into that arrangement. And it really isn't adequate to deal with properties that are in part lease. We think about a situation like the Grandfully Milk Bar, where part of that is a museum asset and part of it isn't. We'd essentially be moving a part of the ownership of that building. So we feel it would be prohibitively expensive for little gain, and we prefer to focus on the other two options. And really that's the update from me. And I'll hand over to Dylan.
Thank you, Alex. So just before we seek some questions, quickly to clarify, we're not saying we're ruling out option two. Option two still sits on the table, but we do need to go away and get more clarity and more information for you around that. But at this stage, it does appear to be unfavourable. But I do want to reiterate why we started doing this piece of work and the outcomes sought for the future. Increasingly, council and community boards are being asked to fund more and more activity across the district. We all know that, we see that regularly, and of course we can't continue to fund everything, but behind all these requests for funding are a lot of very passionate people within our community who do a lot of great work. What we're seeking to do is head out a future where we can enable the sector as best we possibly can and figure out what council's role in that is. Now, one of the confusing factors in the conversation we've had today is around what happens with property, and particularly whether property sits at an ownership level, what council's role is in that, or community board's role in that, in repairs and maintenance. And then that gets confused across other things, such as the operational activity or the grant funding that's been received in the past. So that's the work we're trying to tidy up and give you a really clean steer on in this next report coming to you in April. What we have seen and what's been really positive in this last 18 months or so has been the formation of the trust, and showing that the sector is really willing to work together and really looking at what the future could be as they come together. So there's been some real positives. There's been some challenges. We've gone down a lot of rabbit holes throughout this process. We're trying to pull ourselves back out of the weeds and get you some really clear clarity as we move forward. So opening for the questions, I get to you, Tim.
Thank you. Questions?
Yeah, I do.
Yes.
Question or statement?
Either or.
Do you want, you okay with a statement?
Yes.
Firstly, the report, and I want to emphasise it's the rationale report, not your report, but the rationale report, I think, needs a lot of work. I didn't find it easy to read, and there was some stuff in there which I've put forward to you that I just don't think makes any sense in terms of numbers and presumptions and so forth. So I look forward to that being revamped in our April meeting. We've just heard from Otago Museum that they're, with all due respect, then in a financially untenable position that's got to be resolved. And here we have a number of museums in central Otago that have grown through the structures that we have in place that have led us to some problems. And one of the problems that I see, if we look just here in Alexandria, we've got Central Stories, we've got Balance Cottage, we've got a $5 million museum on the books for Clyde, a $6 million museum well advanced in the planning stage in Cromwell. In 5 years, if we carry on down this path, we're going to have 3 museums within 30 kilometres, 2 of which are brand new, and chances are we'll be telling the same story, which is utter madness in my view. I look forward to the April meeting because there is a part of me that, and again, I have a little bit of struggle because the in the report it says that option 1 is the closest to the status quo. I even struggle in the rationale report to work out where that's at, but for me, the current status quo model has to be there. The pure status quo, what we've got at the moment, has to be an option in April, because that's the one where the financial constraints will be brought closest to home, which will be at the board level of got yourself in this mess. See what you're going to do. Not a question. I'm just looking forward to April.
Noted.
Thanks. Mine's not a question either, I don't think. And I support what Tim says. I mean, that rationale report is a snapshot, and I struggle with the idea of not districtizing both property and grants, because my belief is that the museum cries out to be policy needs to be districtized, and that can't be done properly if the community boards retain control over property. It just won't work. So if there are bureaucratic, if there are problems of process around districtising property, that I think they have to be overcome. And I know it's an ongoing, there's other reports to come, but yeah, this is Tim put in a concrete way. This doesn't address capital expenditure at all. You know, and in fact, it doesn't even address incremental increases in operating expenses. Take the 10-year picture, and assumes that everything is just flatlining, which is so it's a limited use. But for me, and I think the ideal path forward is to districtise everything. And if it were me, I would just have a flat special rating for property and grants over the entire rating district. Just to, everyone pays whatever the number of rating units is by the $500,000 or whatever the annual cost is, and then council has to set policy, and we've put in place a museum trust to really coordinate the extraordinarily strong and important volunteer aspect of museums, and we have to set policy in cooperation with that trust. Otherwise, why don't we set it up? And there's going to have to be some hard decisions made, because Tim enumerated the museum we've got, and the one that was most immediate concern really is central storage, because it is just not being utilised properly. And until we include capital expenditure and the opportunity costs, when we look at the number of museums in the physical property side, we're just playing around the edges. So if there are difficulties implementing funding property district-wide, we just have to overcome them, in my view.
If I may, I've spoken over it all so much. That third option gives us the ability to really do it in theory without needing to go through all of those hoops, by using a similar model to the libraries, where they exist within ward ownership, not full ownership, but the wards control, but they have a district function within them, and they therefore are subject to that district law and those district criteria. So we could essentially do the practical application of the option without needing to do all of that exchange. So that's really between yourself and me, we've landed on the option.
That's the vehicle to do it.
Yeah.
To achieve the option. But to me, it's an absolute no-brainer. We have to districtise museums, and we have to set the policy in the country. And I think we know now from the workshops we did last year that there's some difficult decisions we made. We can't support it. And I noticed the graph on, I think, page 57, noticing the museum services that we're currently funding. And I wondered whether even more should have been included in that.
It's an election.
Essentially, I know because of the way it started and has grown, it's sort of sitting outside the museum strategy, but I would have thought it needs to be pulled back within the museum policy and its revenue and costs to be part and parcel of that.
That's really step one about what constitutes a museum.
So I've got a couple of questions regarding Tibet Valley. So we're obviously getting the least amount in terms of grants by quite a long way. So if we were to be districtised, I suppose my question would be, would that mean that that museum wouldn't need to come to the community board to ask for grants? So would that be covered within the districtisation? And the second question I've got is, our museum actually just bought their building outright. So how do we then say to that group that we want to put that museum, districtise it and take that away from them when they've actually paid for that building themselves?
So, yeah, sure. So yes, in theory, the community board wouldn't have any further financial input unless it wished to, through additional activity onto the fund. And that would be through the normal process that currently exists with such funding. The property component is again one of those confusing components, which, as we've seen in the past, these are given to council at some point in the future, and I suppose there's a potential that that may happen from Teviot, but you could certainly understand that the Teviot Museum would be saying, why are we owning and having to look after our building double zone?
I would just add to that, so we legally couldn't use that site, so we had that same situation in Ranfurly, the museum, which was owned by a trust. And I think it's been part of the real challenging property conversations. Some of the buildings we own, some we don't. So there'd be no legal mechanism if there was a district model. We'd just be looking at our buildings. But you're right, it's a consideration as to why other parts of the world have both a building and some grant funding in council. Sticking that up.
Thank you. So,
Just to follow through, particularly, trying to remember when it happened. The case with Central Stories was because the building was on land owned by council. So when the trust that was running the building recognised that financially it couldn't continue, it walked away and we inherited a building. What could happen with Teviot is the group that runs that building, for whatever reason, decides they can't do it. You know whose door they're going to come knocking on. Very hard to say no, but well, some people might find it hard to say no.
Sorry, just also to respond. So we will definitely dive deeper into what option 2 looks like at that distributising land and figure out what and how that can work. The other one I just want to address as well is around the rationale report, and in fairness to rationale, we received that report in November. We've been working through to try to get to a point we felt actually ideally, we would have been able to workshop this collectively, but due to other pressures and timelines, we haven't been able to. So what we wanted to do is come together, draw your questions. We'll now go back to rationale as well, and then work through tidying up that report and get that thing. So yeah, please don't take that as a reflection of rationale's work. That's been a bit of work between the two parties.
This challenge we are going to face is that how we reflect through this process our individual community's passion for their history and sense of place. Where Central Otago is unique because it is such a diversity of stories, some very similar, but they are still unique to that place. And it's why I like the idea of the trust being involved. In any form of districtisation, you run the risk of rationalisation. I can't see a time in this community where we will have a museum, even though that to a form of logic says that's what we should be doing, but we can't. And if we put that, if we go into this process with that notion that we need to celebrate our individual senses of place, then we'll come out with a better answer than trying to rationalise it into just having a museum, which supposedly represents the whole of Central Otago. That ain't going to happen.
On the counter side of that, Martin, the previous report and this report make me very concerned. And when it says something like the museum sector locally, nationally and internationally faces significant challenges with ongoing funding constraints and often a reliance on a declining volunteer workforce, we can't keep giving everybody a tiny nibble of a very small pie. We need to be investing, and I think it's up to the trust who are overseeing all of it to tell us what the crown jewels or the taonga are that we want to be investing in and protect. 9 museums in our area, everybody having a tiny nibble of a very small pie is not going to see us into the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And I think Otago Museum and the challenges that they are facing, we need to recognise that and talk with the trust. I think it does need to be sector led. They know what is priority. But I think this is actually a really important conversation to get right now. Otherwise, we're going to get 20 years down the track and nobody's got anything, and we've got a whole heap of abandoned buildings.
Of course, the obvious net is that by making some decisions now, we may have a vibrant centre which reflects the diversity in this community. And with good investment decisions being made now, in 20 years' time, we'll have a buoyant centre which is an attraction for people to come and visit this area, because it does represent the diversity of what goes on in this district.
And I think that needs to be the end goal. So on that note, yes, Nick.
The bit that concerns me about the rationale report is that trying to understand if they've really captured what's going to happen in Cromwell. Because Cromwell doesn't know what's going to happen in Cromwell yet either. So there's a moving target that I can't shoot just yet. Yeah. Because that's going to have a huge impact on the bigger picture, no matter what.
And the same could be said about what's proposed for Clyde too.
Yes, correct. Not sure how far that down the track is.
Well, that's quite a considerable way down the track.
The reality is that for us ultimately to come to agreeing some sort of strategy, our community is going to want to have a very large say in that. And TV is a great example, because they're not paying anything. And the talking models are going to say, well, you're going to pay something and keep on doing what you're doing, potentially. So I just think that the timing couldn't be worse. But better to get it sorted before Cromwell goes down the path and Clyde get in the path of putting more than $10 million into a facility that in the end may have a very tenuous timeframe of existence. Because purest of thought, the call might be made that we actually do what they do in Auckland, Wellington, and have one museum and a second one somewhere else. Because some economics has got to come into this. Yeah. As much as we love our heritage, and we all know that our communities do, they're fiercely proud of it and they want to protect it. And the question will be and do you want to protect it at these sort of costs? Yeah.
Sorry, I just have another bite at the cherry. I mean, this report is fine as far as it goes. It's just nuts and bolts, it's operational. Yeah. And we desperately need something that focuses on the strategy. And to have a museum strategy, you've got to districtise. There's just no other option. And Tame is right, we're funding a museum trust for $50,000 a year. You've got to use them, that's what they're there for. And those capital expenditures that are being talked about, and it's not just capital, it's operational. If you put a new museum in Cromwell, its operational costs will double to triple. Yeah. Because otherwise, why would you build a new museum? It'll just, and that has to be decided around this table. And there are going to be some, we're talking about significant rate rises. And we've just got to get the strategy around this table. Otherwise we'll just continue muddling along.
Correct.
I did have one question, please, Dylan.
Yeah.
Why is central stories in the works and services and not rec and culture? There was just a little blurb about it being in a different pot.
In terms of the rating pot?
Yes, is on the bottom of page 57 of the agenda, museum property costs. It says they're funded except for central stories through our targeted rate for rec and culture. I just wonder why central stories is not.
I don't have the exact answer. I would make an assumption because the building is more than just the museum. Susan? Yeah. Yeah. So a portion.
Thank you. Great. On that, someone happy to move that the report be received, please. Thank you, Lindley. Seconded Nigel. All those in favour? Aye. Against? Carried.
Thank you, Tamer. The next item is on page 71, and that is yours, Neil.
It is too. Call up. We can go.
Wonderful industry.
Right, item 23.2.5, Linda. Welcome. Got your knitting needles? Sorry. So we've got a report about the request for easement over the Cromwell reservoirs. And I'll pass over to Linda to take us through that report.
Good morning, everybody. Today I am here to ask you to approve an easement being granted over section 111 block 3 of the Cromwell Survey District. The Cromwell Reservoir is located on section 111 and it is about to undergo a very large upgrade. To do that, we will need to put power into the site, and that power would be an easement in favour of Aurora Energy. Assuming you are all happy with that, the recommendation is to grant that easement subject to Aurora or the agents obtaining all consents and permits associated with putting that infrastructure in. The final plan being approved by the Chief Executive Officer. Will there be any questions relating to that matter?
Recommendation on page.
I'm happy to move that.
Hey, should someone like to second it?
Yeah.
No, Nigel's looking before you. So you can do the next one. All those in favour? Yes, carried. Item 23.2.6, a request for an easement over the Bannockburn reservoir site. Linda, is that the same as you last time?
So almost the same as last time. So the purpose of this upgrade is to put power into the site. It's currently powered by solar, which is not particularly reliable, and it will also add some resilience to the site for anything that's required in the future. So assuming you are all happy to grant that, to grant that easement over the area hatched pink in figure 3 to Aurora Energy for the purpose of conveying energy, electricity over section 1 to the reservoir, which is sitting on the lot behind. I lost where I was going with that.
You were going to say any question?
Any question? That's right.
Someone like to move. Tracy, don't move. Nigel, I'm going to give it to Nigel just because he doesn't get many opportunities. Any comments? All in favour? It's carried. Thank you, Linda. Well done.
Perfect.
Thank you, Neil. I just recognise the next item is yours from Nigel, but I did say to Mr McCutcheon he would be 12 o'clock and it's 12 minutes to. What I might do is I might do my mayor's report. That's probably going to be about that length of time, and he may well arrive back by then. I would hate to have said to him to be back at 12 and then we'll deal with it in his absence. I don't think that would be too fair nor well received. So my mayor's report, if I can jump in, is on page 159. It's not that bad, Mark. Oh yes, staff are most welcome to wait when we do this. Thanks so much. So as the report says, like the rest of the nation, sadly been shocked by what's happened in the North Island. And I'll carry on from that, having been at National Council and Rural and Provincial last week, that we had opportunities to talk to mayors from those affected areas. And there's a number of things I'd like to raise. One is we just don't really, I don't think, comprehend down here how vast and bad this thing is and how long it's going to have impact on the lives of everybody up there. It's just incredibly bad. And so I think as rural leaders in the community, when somebody moans to you about the price of kumara next year, I'm going to pull their heads in, because the whole nation's got to get behind the people of the North Island too, whose lives, in some cases, their lives have been ended terribly, and in other places they've been upended. And so we need to stand together with these folk, because there are people and our day will come, fortunately. And on that basis too of what happens for us, this is a really brutal reminder of all our roles in the civil defence situation and how that can come about, could come about before lunch. We don't know, but we all need to be aware that we have a role to play. We'll have to update ourselves on what those roles are. And a big part of that is just talking to the community and saying, have you got a plan? Are you on the Get Ready website for the text messages that come? And the Ranfurly water situation was a recent one where Get Ready was a really effective way to tell Ranfurly folk they were on boil water dose. But when it comes down to being able to communicate with people and communications, talking to some of the mayors in the North Island, the loss of communication was absolutely fundamental. So you had a situation where when things get that bad, you might not think of it. I hadn't, but there was no power, no communication, so therefore there was no EFTPOS. So you couldn't go to the bank and get money out. You couldn't use your card at the supermarket. So what very quickly happened was people got what cash they could scrape together, took that to the supermarket. Suddenly the supermarket became full of cash, but then the community became empty of cash. And I won't name the district, but that district stepped in and wrote the supermarket a massive check, and then used a Starlink phone to EFTPOS money so that the money could go around, because the whole thing ground to a halt. And that was with 2 or 3 days of no communication. Very quickly it ground to a halt. And one hates to think when people got hungry or desperate what might have happened if the council hadn't stepped in at that point. So there's so many lessons to be learned from this, and they'll keep coming. And I think the biggest one is that we need to be just for years now. So it's going to be Christchurch all over again. I know it was a propensity to get tired of earthquake stories, but we're going to be living with this for a long time, and we can't forget about them. Right. Susan mentioned earlier on the Adopt a Community scheme. I'm really grateful to, for those of you who have done the Adopted program, I'm a purple dot. I come up with ideas. It's really good to have people around me that actually make them happen. It's generally that sort of game. LGNZ was fantastic in that, and it was really gratifying to hear the mayors from those areas say that at their level and at the community level, it actually really meant something, that communities were saying, well, we're going to wrap you up. We're going to have a shared lunch today for the Central Hawke's Bay Mayoral Relief Fund, and I've had some discussions with Martin about other ideas for funds, which some of you may be involved in yet, you just don't know it. We've got 33 councils in here, which is really cool. I've put my thoughts down there on my thinking on the Dunedin Hospital, which I've taken a fair bit of flack on. That's life. I just want to re-emphasise the line that if the people that the mayors and chairs of Otago and Southland have been given the opportunity to talk to, including the local advisory group, clinical transformation group, amongst others, had said, we need you in Dunedin at 12 o'clock waving a placard in George Street, I would be there without hesitation. But when those folks say the fight was fought back in August and they've got a place they can live with out of that, and when you have the chair of the local advisory group, also a former Minister of Health and former chair of the Southern District Health Board, put in the paper that the cuts to the original plans have quite virtually no impact on services or clinical capacity, I'm afraid it's not a bandwagon I'm going to jump on. Uncertainty remains on the Lake Onslow project. There was an announcement that was expected mid-February. That's been delayed. So really, we don't know. Nobody knows. I have had no word further than that. But I think it's really important for the community, if and when that announcement comes, that's whether or not a business plan is going to be looked at. So it's not a, yes, we're building the dam. It could be a no, we're not. But even if it is a yes to the next step, we're still a long way away from the project going ahead. So no need to panic, I guess, is the word there. What does look like getting a green light, as I've noted there, is the gold mine near Terrace, and that's going to have significant impact in terms of jobs and where people are going to live and so forth. I spoke to the select committee on the latest Three Waters legislation, and I just, and so there was a council presentation that Julie fronted, and there was another one that I fronted, sort of got two bites of the cherry. Mine focused solely on the harmonisation or the standardisation of pricing. And in doing that, I've gone back through all the stuff we were given in 2020, even before that. And in those early days, it was very plain that the promise that was being made was we'd be paying the same per litre of water as Christchurch, we'd be paying the same connection as Greymouth and so forth, eventually. And it's not in the bill. It's down to a government policy statement that can be changed by a whim of politicians every 3 years or less. There is nothing there to stop us as a community falling into the same situation as we found with Aurora, where simply prices fall where they lie policy comes into play, and we get, as the term I used directly to the select committee was, we'll get screwed over again, because it was the Electricity Authority that put that in with the customised price path for Aurora. It's a government agency dealing with the monopoly, exactly the same as what we have on the Three Waters. The National Party have come out with their policy. I won't go into the pros and cons of that, but what it does mean is that if National is elected, then we will have control of our three waters after the 1st of July 2024. At the moment, the law says that we need to build our LTP on the basis that we don't have control over it. We're going to have some serious thinking about how we deal with that, because 14th of October 2023 is too damn late to start doing another LTP, I would think. I've mentioned there the census. I hope you've all been counted. I'm sure you will have. And how great it was to go to the A&P shows again. It was just magnificent. I missed them dearly. Dribbled hot dog tomato sauce down the front of my shirt, which is an annual tradition. It was marvellous. So thank you to the organisers of those, particularly in the Maniatoto, that put it on with a boil water notice in place, and thank you to staff and community who made that and allowed that to happen. And that is my report. If anybody's got any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Otherwise, I'll move it.
I'll second it.
Thank you, Neil. Any questions or comments? No, thank you, everybody. All those in favour, aye, and against, carried. Welcome back, Mr. McCutcheon. We'll move to you. Thank you, Nigel.
Thank you. So we have item 23.2.7, page 82, after purchase private wastewater infrastructure, and you have Linda and or Judy to talk to it.
Hello again. So I will take the report read, but quite happy to recap the background and some discussion for you. So back in 2006, Clyde Claim applied to undertake a development which is continues to be referred to as the Clyde Claim in Clyde. As part of the resource consent requirements associated with that development, Clyde Claim were required to put in an internal private reticulation system to cater to the properties in that development, and they were also required to put a treatment plant on a separate lot that would process that waste. That work was all done. There is a plan of the wider development on the top of page 84, and there is a plan of the internal infrastructure shown on the bottom of the same page. Lot 1 can be seen in the top left-hand corner of each of those. It contains that treatment plant for that development. As you all know, we have now put in a reticulation system in Clyde, a stage project, and the properties in the historic area that are identified in stage 1, which includes the Clyde Claim development, are now all connected to that reticulation system, with the exception of the Clyde Claim development. The ownership of the wastewater treatment plant and that reticulation transferred to an entity that is known as Clyde Claim Services, and that is run independently as a body corporate styled company that looks after all of those services and tends to do their repair, maintenance, charges, costs, etc. on behalf of those residents. Back in 2020, Council did write to Clyde Claim Services and expressed an interest to purchase Lot 1, which contains the treatment plant, following its decommissioning and the connecting of the Clyde Claim development to the new coming reticulation system. Clyde Claim Services came back in 2022 and offered to sell Lot 1 and the internal reticulation to Council for the sum of $800,000 plus GST. It was an indicative offer. However, by that point, Council had entered into another agreement to purchase land behind the Masonic Lodge, and while we had identified that car parking would be a good use for Lot 1, we have since constructed toilets on the land that we have purchased from the Masonic Lodge, and we have constructed another toilet on what is now referred to as the River Park, which is the recreation reserve behind Miners Lane down beside the river. There is a path and roading has been put in to connect that development, that river park, with that parking and that additional toilet to the heritage precinct, and following consideration by the project governance group, the offer was declined. Of also purchasing lot 1 and the reticulation. The wide claim services have come back now and asked for council to give consideration or reconsider their offer to purchase lot 1 and that internal reticulation system. But today we will be talking about the internal reticulation, and the purchase offer to purchase lot 1 will be dealt with separately, because obviously the commercial discussions. So the background, as far as supply chain services go, it is a body corporate company which is owned by the shareholders who are property owners in applied claim development. They have a range of shareholdings in that company, from 10,000 to 62,500. So an interesting mix of shareholdings in that company. As far as connecting to the new reticulation system, the company has not agreed to the connection being made because they wanted this matter regarding the ownership of the internal reticulation be resolved prior to that connection being made. There's a number of benefits in council owning or taking over the internal reticulation, and it would be also mutually beneficial to both parties. For example, based on the current design of stage 2 of the project, there are properties on Hazlitt Street that could be plumbed into that reticulation, and that would reduce the ongoing costs for council, because we would then be able to use a gravity fed process to take that waste from those properties, rather than having to pump it up Hazlitt Street and into the reticulation main that comes down Holloway Street behind lot 1. The main comes down behind lot 1, and the figure 6 on page 87, and the associated benefits for Clyde Claim would include disposing of their responsibilities as they relate to the ongoing repair and maintenance of that system, which is currently a drain in common, and it would relieve the shareholders of the associated with the depreciation and future planning. So as far as that goes, the recommendation today is that if council agrees to take over that reticulation system, and that we would do so at a nil transfer, as in quid pro quo, based on that benefit for both parties. Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, I do. Yeah. So just make sure I've got this clear, is that this agenda item deals only with the infrastructure itself.
Correct.
And not the land.
No.
And the recommendation is saying that we would take over the infrastructure, and each party will get its own costs in that transaction, and we would be responsible for the ownership, get the benefit of the easements, and the property issue the separate matter.
Yes, we would expect the ownership of it to transfer to council, and then for that to provide for council to then, we would obviously have that ability to connect those other stages, other properties on Hazlitt Street that are in stage 2 to that, each party to pay their own costs, and on the proviso then that Clyde Claims Services agree to making that connection to that point on Holloway Street in front of lot 1, as it's shown on figure 6. There is a lateral already installed and ready and available for that connection to be made.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other question?
Just as a point of clarification here, Ken, we have had some legal advice that in terms of the connection, we're able to, council's requirement is to provide, it's just to provide a connection to the drain common. We don't actually have to provide individual connections to all of the properties, that which is why we proposed that connection to the yellow line.
So thank you, London, to the I think it's a very fair position, situation. I think it's very useful to separate infrastructure question from the land question, so that makes it much more transparent. So we have before us recommendations A, B, and C. Just before I ask for a mover, can I just be pedantic and the second bullet point on recommendation B, it says Client Claim Services Limited agreeing to council connecting additional properties to the system as and when required at its own discretion. Should that be at council's own discretion rather than?
Yeah.
So with that change, do I have a mover and a second? Taylor, Sally, second. Any further discussion? All those in favour? Against? Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Nigel.
And sorry, maybe can I just jump sideways very quickly while we've got Judy sitting at the table? Because Judy's taken the trouble to put on the whiteboard behind you a fundraising thermometer, but a fund spending thermometer. And if you may remember at the last council meeting, we talked about the program spending of $60 million between now and July 1st, 2024. It's going to be a considerable challenge. And this is just an interim report. And if I could ask the Mayor's agreement for Julie just to explain that we are making, that graph shows we are making progress. We've gone from 14 million to 16 million of expenditure, and there's a wee graph to the right showing that things are moving.
We were asked to provide this in the council chambers on council meeting days. So the A3 below is the one we presented in January to your meeting in January. So this one is hot off the press in the last couple of days. That while the expenditure has gone from 14 million to 16 million, which is shattering in 6 weeks, for us the important thing is that the amount of red on the A3 has reduced on the big picture. So that means work that's sitting there to be delivered by the 30th of June 2024 has moved from sitting on a list into active planning. And our objective before your next meeting will be to get a whole lot more of the orange turned to green, which means it's actually an execution. There you go, that's a simple explanation. Just one thing to be aware if you're looking at it is the bars that list all the projects in the middle, they are based just on the budgets that we have in the system for 22-23. It doesn't include next year's budgets as well. So if we put those on, unfortunately, the black line that shows what we've got to spend versus the green line on what we've achieved would look quite different because there's a lot of money in the budget next year.
Thank you, Julie. So just councillors' attention to it, and it'll happen again next month. So thank you, Julie.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nigel. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Linda. We now move to page 91 of the agenda. Claudia and David, welcome to the table. This is a report on our wilding pine policy. And before we come to you, Gordon and David, there has been some discussion about the members of council who are also members of the Vincent Community Board having a perceived or a real conflict. Tamer, you have something to say on that matter?
Yes, I'm prepared to note.
Thank you.
Councillors who are also Vincent Community Board members have discussed whether they have a conflict, perceived or otherwise, in participating in the discussion and vote on the item concerning the wilding conflict strategy policy. Given all members discussed and voted on this policy when it came before council and the policy relates to the district as a whole, we're happy that there is no conflict that can be managed.
Thank you. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Kia ora, Council. Today we seek to understand from the Vincent Community Board as to whether Council's policy on wilding conifers allows for staged removal. Before we get into that, and also referenced in the report, I want to go back through history just so we're all on the same page. More than 20 years ago, it was identified that certain species of conifers had been introduced to New Zealand sometime in the 1800s. that, when exposed to certain elements, had a high probability of spreading to the point of consuming much of New Zealand's native land if left unmanaged. It became a conversation about having the right tree in the right place. Fast forward to 2016, after much research and the increased spread of wild and conifer trees across New Zealand, the central government allocated $100 million fund to felling wild and conifers that have become pests that threaten wildlife, native tree species, and farmland, to name a few. Over the course of the last 6 years, central, regional, local governments, businesses and private landowners had taken responsibility to remove the pest species, often beginning in high-risk areas. From 2016 to now, the Otago region alone has spent in excess of $16 million in the removal of wilding pines from countless locations around Otago. In July 2022, the Central Otago District Council passed a policy for wilding conifers on council land, so that the council would do its bit in the eradication of the spread of wilding conifers in New Zealand. At this point, I must acknowledge the challenge of this topic. In a world where we challenge ourselves to be clean and sustainable, we're also continually learning about how to do this right. In this case, the argument is having the right tree in the right place. Council's policy provides a determination on what should happen when there is the wrong tree in a place on land that is owned or managed by council. I must also acknowledge that there is council land that contains wilding conifers that is also currently being used by the community for amenity and or recreational purposes. Any change here is going to be a challenge in the short term, and I think it's important we acknowledge and we continually learn from our experience together as we approach this challenge of the wrong tree in certain areas. Legal advice was sought on the policy, which calls for the proactive eradication of wilding conifers on council land. This is to reduce the impact that council-owned wilding conifers has over neighbouring properties, to show leadership, to do its bit for the wider community, and to align with New Zealand's approach to wilding conifers. Some key aspects to the policy to help your decision making are also found within the agenda and within the report on page 98 and 99 of the agenda.
Just to add a little bit further, so wilding conifers refer to around a dozen species of conifers that have been planted or have self-seeded in the wrong place. And it's estimated about 2 million hectares of New Zealand is currently affected by wilding conifers. But around 70% of that infested areas have had some control work, but the spread is continuing. They overwhelm our native landscapes and the habitats of native birds, lizards, insects and plants. And each mature cone on pine tree has around 50 to 100 seeds. And each tree has around 100 fruiting cones at any one time. And the table within the report outlines the potential seed rain that during wind event could spread to other lands. It does spread to other lands actually. If we take the half mile in Alexandra as an example, if a staging option of 2/3 to 1/3 was undertaken, then a significant number of seed would still be produced to spread. Excuse me. Using the stats just mentioned and assuming a really low 2% germination rate of those seeds, we would see in 3 years the gain from removing those trees lost to new seedlings. And it is also important to note that the cost of control is estimated by the National Wilding Conifer Control Group to increase 30% every year that control work is delayed. And it's also important to maintain the areas where trees have been removed for up to 3 years to prevent any seedlings from re-establishing on those areas that have been cleared. And to the policy, when applying the policy, it is important that regard is had to the purpose and intent of the policy. And there are some key statements contained within the policy that will help council.
Central Otago District Council has long supported the eradication of wilding pines through its sponsorship, along with the Department of Conservation and Otago Regional Council of the Central Otago Wilding Conifer Group. And in the last term, you took specific steps to take that further and take responsibility of the eradication on the land that we ourselves own. This was a direct response to community feedback and our own desire to be a good citizen around a well-known and identified pest. Based on Council's commitment and the strategic direction that you have set, as well as the research evidence available to us as discussed, our recommendation is that the staging removal of wild and conifers would be inconsistent with the core objective to the policy of eradicating wild and pines from council-owned and managed land. It gives a summary of the report. Woody and I are happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. So the proposed, well, the way I am going to be handling this is thus. There'll be an opportunity for councillors to ask questions of David and Gordy on the subject. Then there'll be an opportunity of going around the room. So I don't want statements. Everyone's going to get a chance to do that, but we're not going to make statements until we've had all our questions answered. But I'm going to break from what I've just said in the first half. Before I do that, I want councillors to remain cognizant at all times that we're discussing a district-wide thing. This is not about the half mile, although it will have an effect on the half mile one way or the other. But we are discussing a district-wide policy. What I did note wasn't in the report, and Ken Churchill has probably guided me towards this, as he was saying staging of 7 to 10 years. Is what the board's thinking was. So I'm going to get Tamer as chair of that board in terms of what was the board thinking in terms of the staging, because I think that's fundamental to decisions. Then we'll come to questions of the agenda. Tamer.
From my understanding, the thoughts from the DCB around the staging were a period of 3 to 5 years. And probably the only thing I noted that wasn't included in the report when referring to the half mile was the fact that a permanent access road through that site exists because it is required to maintain the power pylon.
Thank you. Right, questions for these guys, please. I emphasise questions. Yeah.
Well, I'll start with the first one. And looking at our policy, the bit that troubles me is probably back to some basics about what's in the policy. So the question that's been raised makes you look at other things, but it talks about some definitions of what wilding trees are, and the word planted is included in them. So unless I'm reading wrong, to operate with the machine, it says that wilding is the term used for natural regeneration or self-seeding spread of introduced trees. How does it apply to trees that are planted and then become a source of wilding trees? So what I'm wondering is that whether we've got some fundamental things of the policy to get right as well. The staging to me becomes the secondary issue, but if the basics aren't right, it makes it hard to take it forward. So I'm wondering whether, you know, others may not think that's important, but I would have thought that, because there seems to be a real misconception out in the wide world about a wilding tree. And so I will use an example, which is not my half mile, I'll use the Cromwell one. We bowled a whole lot of trees on the Sugarloaf. They were planted as a shelter belt with someone else's money way back when, for Nigel was born. Or even before I was born. Yes, I could possibly read the old section. And as people, you rightly said, they weren't bowling at all because they were planted.
Yeah.
They were undoubtedly a source of other trees that grew wild from there. Seems to be pretty clear.
Yeah.
But I think we don't have that basic fundamental part of the policy covered well off. We're never going to educate people to understand the bit that's really missing. Because people say, but it's not wilding. All right, it's planted, so it can't be wilding by the normal definition of the word. That policy seems, I might be wrong, but it seems to not actually refer to that. And it is what I take my reading right. And it's not, if it is that way, then it's not a criticism, just one of those things. That's my question.
Can I have a first stand?
Yeah.
And this may or may not be fair, but it's sort of where we concluded within my own family on this, because it's been a topic of much debate as well, is that when we talk about wilding pines, sometimes people are using a noun and sometimes they're using an adjective. And I think irrespective of whether it is planted or a tree that has been established from a seed that has blown into a place, the effect is the same. Both have the capacity to spread. So one is either
a noun, i.e. it's randomly grown over there because the seed landed, or as an adjective, it was planted but has the capacity to spread.
Good point, and totally agree with, the definition needs to reflect that better. So there is, I would say the fact that it is both is clearly known and understood, because I think that gives it in the platform, so it's a wilding tree. To get the fact it was planted, definition of wilding is this, and at the moment, that low level issue, which is fundamental to everything else that follows, seems to be what the
Gentlemen, what stands?
I was just going to say, I thought that was sort of, well, it may not be explicit, but self-seeding spread is spread from a tree, whether it is one of those two options.
Yeah, but
it's not specific.
Yeah,
I understand.
Yeah. In Sri Lanka, for example, they were planted. So you look at the definition of wilding as the term used for natural regeneration or self-seeding spread of introduced trees. They were planted, so they don't meet the definition.
We can amend the policy by recommendation.
Yeah, that's what I want to pick up today. So that basically, because my view is that a lot of misunderstanding that it starts from there.
We could ask, I'm very nervous about recreating definitions on the run, but it could come back to us. So we'll park that for now.
Yeah, cool.
Thank you.
I just be one of the questions I gave was
Stu, we're just having questions at the moment. We're going to hear statements from everybody. We're going to go around the room on this one. Martin.
As a council policy, which has a direct effect on community board budgets, is there some discussion, the fact is that then the council as a whole should pick up those costs as opposed to the policy affecting a board and the costs will then incur with that board?
Okay, I'm just going to pause there, and I should have done this with Neil in all fairness. Our question today is whether or not staging is considered in the policy. And now we've got twice, we've gone off on tangents. No. You can have that come back, and you could have had that come back. Because this is about staging. It's not about whether the pines are wild or not, because that's already under the definition. It could come back. I don't want us to be going down tangents.
I beg to differ, because if it's under the definition, then it's not, these aren't wild trees.
Well, now, with the topic today is staging. Right. Further questions on staging?
Well, how long might it take to establish new plantings in areas where the pines have been fed?
So, I guess that depends a little bit on what we plant. And I think what is envisaged, and what the site is. So you would,
So you're looking at 3 years or 10 years or sort of 15 years to establish a decent vegetative cover?
I think to Gordy's point, it will depend on the area. I guess how long the pines have been present for, how much, I guess the nutrients that are taken out of the ground. It would vary, and then also depending on what you plant as well. If you're going for a replant of something that's a little bit smaller, the growth time might be a little bit quicker. Naturally, something taller would take longer. So that will probably be on a site-by-site basis of what that will cost to re-establish, if it was even a re-establishment option.
Yeah, and also whether it's natives or exotics or a mix, because they will grow at different rates in different parts of different areas, different growth rates.
Good question. Further questions on stage? No? Right, in that case, I'm going to go around.
I've got a question.
Oh, sorry. No.
It's a further one to what Ian said. If you're re-establishing natives or other exotics in a particular environment, having other trees in that environment to offer shelter and is that an advantage?
For my opinion would be not really, because the shelter trees grow anyway with or without shelter, and depending what we are growing, whether they need shelter or not. All species are bound to season. And some places have their own shelters, some places, I guess if you look at your own garden, you know which way the wind blows. And what happens there with shelter, some trees are affected by the wind and some aren't.
A supplementary to Martin's one, if the shelter is provided by pines which drop needles that tend to not be too helpful for the soil underneath, would that be problematic to new plantings?
Yes, as I've said in the report, pines to be allergenic, which means they don't like, sorry, I would not say poison the soil, but they put chemicals in the soil that inhibit other things growing, especially their own thing as well. That's why they like to spread on wings. So they get further and further out to virgin soil, and that's how they spread, rather than like some forests, New Zealand forests in particular, stuff grows right underneath the parent tree. That doesn't happen so much with pine trees.
Further questions?
Yes.
Here we go.
I'm really intrigued because your report says that within the policy, there is nothing that specifically prohibits or prevents the stage removal. And then the recommendation says, agree that it's against policy. To me, I think you told me that we didn't think about this when we did the policy. We thought about a lot of other stuff you told me about. But would that be a fair way of putting it? Is that actually staging has not been considered? So the policy doesn't cover it. But you're asking me to accept the fact that in the background and thinking of it, we kind of meant to, or we meant this.
No, I think, seeing I wrote it, and to come out at some point, I wasn't thinking of staging at all.
No.
Because of the fact, all the reasons in the end, the spread and the cost and all that stuff. That's why it was front loaded. The policy is front loaded with those things.
Which is not a reflection of anything done wrong. It's just the reality.
Yeah.
And the question is now posed. And I guess to me it's a bit of a conflict to say, well, I didn't think of it, but no, it's not covered. You're not wrong. So there's the other way wrong. Is you stage or not?
Yes, it's always.
Yes. Well, I think
at the end of the day, no. They're not statements. Well, I mean. No, it's question time. We're gonna have statements. Right, any more questions? No? Yes, no?
I mean, a question is, why now when the rest of the regions had to have an eradication policy over the last 10 years in rural New Zealand? So why is that discussion coming up now? It didn't come up 10 years ago.
So that we didn't have wide and confident.
Well, when it first came up, because it's been addressed in the whole time I've been here on the council. And rural New Zealand's dealt with that a lot. It seems to be once it gets urbanised, it seems to be a problem.
Very well crafted questions, Judy. Right, gonna go around the room. I'm gonna start with on my right, Neil, views on staging.
it's just not that simple. To me, I think I remember there was quite a bit of debate about whether the policy should have had a wider process before we adopted it. Maybe staging might have come up as part of it. I'm not convinced that staging is not permitted by the current policy. In fact, I'm actually convinced that it is permitted because it's not there. So I think at the very least we need to decide whether we want to make that an option that's available. And then if we do, it lets those that are funding the works, which was what someone asked before, bear that in mind. Because the reality is we are already staged. How many other stands of fallen conifers under the correct definition are there around this district already that aren't being attacked because there's no money? So they're actually already being staged. The financial implications of controlling these fallen things means that it has to be. So whether you even need to change the policy is up for debate, in my view. I wasn't part of the process that got it here, so I'm not quite sure how it works. So I think that staging should be an option that's able to be considered going forward. And I still think we should take the opportunity to correct some other things that probably just make a bit of a ride for our back and provide for some indecision and then give clarity in the community at the same time.
June.
I do agree with Neil, it'll probably happen naturally because you can't cut all the logging pines down in 1 week. But I do think it's an urban problem that we can fix in rural, and I'm not in favour of stage. It's like asking the rabbits are old enough to be poisoned. You just gotta, get on with it, and that process will happen over time. And it may be the last cab off the rank to get wherever the blocks are, but no, I'm in favour of just get on with it.
Basically.
The same as Stu.
Really?
Well, the legal opinion to council within the policy that there's nothing that prohibits or prevents staging. And I think we brought in the policy to subvert a community board decision. And now we're saying to change the policy again to subvert a community board decision. I don't feel that's democratic. I don't feel it's what our people are telling us. And I think each case should be considered on its own merits. And the power should remain with community boards to make informed decisions on each case.
I'm trying to recall because you made a statement there that this isn't what the people are telling us. The VCB meeting had a poll, not poll, the submissions, what did they submit? I'm trying to remember.
The poll wasn't clear.
Sorry, it must have been these guys.
So I think from rough, it's around a 60-40 split to remove the pines.
Okay.
And if you're on the Bridge Hill, that was more 50-50 for the residents that lived on it.
Then,
I'm in favour of the policy allowing for stage removal.
and not the vote, this is the reasons why. It's an ability to influence others' thinking.
I think that what happens to the area after they're removed is important in terms of the option to revegetate. And if some recreational amenity value can remain during that time, which could be a significant time period, then I would be keen for that to be an option.
Okay, Sarah.
I think where we're sitting is actually we are staging this across the district. If we're talking district-wide, it's a staged approach because we're not going to go out and cut down every tree on the same day. So staging of perhaps areas is also something to consider. Like that's a staged approach to removal at a higher level than within a site. So maybe we need to look at how we address those sites, like how we prioritise those sites as well. Because that's staging of our works, and that's probably financially constrained. I guess how we choose where we go next. And then if that has a detrimental effect of extending what it's going to cost by staging one part, does that have a knock-on effect to a different area that they're looking at? I think it's bigger than just within one site. I tend to agree with Ian as well. If we're going to go out and bowl everything, we've got to have a plan to regenerate that area as well. I don't know. I actually don't know where I sit in terms of staging a particular area. I've heard both sides for a couple of the prominent sites. But I think it needs to be bigger than that, and we're looking at which sites as well as what we do with it.
Thank you, Martin.
I think the policy should reflect better the aspirations of the community it's servicing. And it's not a case of one cut fits, one site suits all. It doesn't. I think we need to have that flexibility where you can actually manage the situation where clear felling may be appropriate in a particular area, with a staged approach is more applicable in another area. And I tend to agree with what Neil's saying, President. The current policy does not negate staging. What we're being asked now is to bring in an amendment to the policy which specifically outlaws staging. And I think we need to be able to take things more on a case-by-case basis or have that flexibility.
Thank you. Cheryl.
I get where Neil is coming from. However, when this came across our table previously, I think I can only talk for myself. I looked at it in terms of what was the recommendation from the Otago Regional Council, etc., as to how we should be dealing with these particular trees. And that was really that they're a pest, and the recommendation is really to get rid of them. Now, I didn't think about it at the time about our stage that I think we're going to go and do one area. My thought at the time was, okay, if you're doing one area, you get rid of it. That's it, we deal with it. And that's the way I looked at this policy. I didn't think about it being broken down that you go to an area and then you deal with bits. So, yeah, that's where I looked at it from when I voted last time as being we were going to eradicate that area of wilding pines.
Thank you. Nigel.
Yeah. I think we should have a wilding pine policy that explicitly allows for clear felling or staged clearance. My rationale is that particular circumstances, which may be budgetary or community interest or physical geography, will influence any particular program. And I agree with Neil's point that in such matters of pest eradication, wilding pines are effectively doing staged clearances now driven by budgetary considerations. So to me, you build in the flexibility, and you wanted to have some aspirational words that clear felling is preferred. You need to allow the flexibility for either staged or complete.
Thank you. Sorry.
I'm in favour of not staging, because I think that, these are a wild pest. And if we stage it, then it's going to take longer to eradicate it and it's going to cost more.
I agree with Neil and Sarah that we're already effectively staging across the district. Clear felling is obviously the right choice for the bottom line of the business, but council is not a business in the true sense of the word, and we work for and on behalf of our communities. And we have a lot of areas coming up in our district that are very heavily utilised by the public for a variety of reasons. And I think that having the option to stage in some locations and what that looks like should be available in the policy. And I'd also point out that doesn't seem to have been considered that seed source in the ground will result in ongoing work regardless of how and when the trees are removed.
Thank you. No. So thank you for those views. They're appreciated. This is a difficult and emotive subject. For me, I'm of the view that staging is delaying inevitability, and that I'm not hearing a great deal of benefit coming from it, other than perhaps appeasement. There's a cost every time the chainsaws have to go back. There's a cost every time that the traffic management has to be put in place, and I'm concerned about the ongoing spread that's going to happen, not just to what we're trying to stop, but to the land that we're trying to repatriate. It seems to me that we're removing part of the problem, not the problem. And I take on board Stu's point that our rural landowners have been doing this and have been told to do this for a very long time. And the first time that we're getting faced with having to do it on our own property, we're finding issues. How I intend to progress this is this. We've got 3 recommendations in front of us, which will, if passed, mean that there will be a clause put into the wild and conifer control policy that says staging will not be permitted, which will mean in effect that when the wild and conifer control group says this is the first cab off the rank, then that cab gets cleaned up. If in the event that vote fails, then I think we need some further thought on what the word staging means. I think simply pushing staging will be allowed is a bit open, and I don't think we do that today, so I would be saying it should come back with some wording on that, which can also perhaps address some other weaknesses in the policy that have been raised. So I'm going to move. Can we have a discussion on that? We can have a discussion on that after we have the vote on this, because it'll only come up depending on the vote on this. So I'm going to move A, B, and C. I'm looking for a seconder. Thank you, Tracy. Further discussion on A, B, and C? I'm going to get a raise of hands because it's obviously going to be close.
Well, no, because I'm going to propose an amendment to your A, B, and C.
Yes. All right. There you go.
I like your A.
Well, excellent. Yes.
I can do it. Well, the problem I've got is that you beat me to, I want to ask this question before you moved it.
No.
I'm going to second it, but is it a better opportunity to actually put forward a resolution that's the counter to what the recommendation is? Yes. To be either voted down or passed, and then to leave what's been recommended, then the obvious result of the one with the contrary gets voted down.
I considered that. The reason I've gone this way is A, the recommendation's written in front of us, so it's easier than conjuring up. It's easier than conjuring up a counter. But the second reason for it is that if this vote's voted down, then the rest will come back at a later date. What the Vincent Community Board has proposed will continue as of lunchtime today. There won't be a delay to that. The clarification as to staging, how long it can be staged for and so forth, I think it's going to take a bit more detailed work.
Yeah.
So this clarifies the very clear binary question: is there staging or not? What you're asking is if there is staging, it's going to be a lot more complicated and need a lot more.
I can assure you the resolution that I crafted, that I copied and sent you, will not result in.
You're not so much proposing an amendment to my resolution, you're proposing a completely counter.
Absolutely. So you didn't give me the chance.
How about in this case, Mr. Deputy Mayor, that should this amendment, should A, B, and C fail, I will come to you for another A, B, and C. Well, actually, no. Let's get one thing off the table. Let's move up and get that out of the way, because we need to do that. So I move in Tracy seconds that the report is received level of signatures. All those in favour? Aye. Right. And then Neil, if B and C fail, I will come to you for a new B and C. How about that?
Or do we have a discussion what new B and C could look like in different?
Well, it'll be up to Neil to put the amendment and then we'll have a discussion on the amendment. Well, sorry, it's not an amendment, it's a new B and C. Right. Okay, so I've moved B and C.
I wasn't sure.
A's been moved, isn't it though?
Well, we have a discussion about the resolution, don't we?
I'd asked for discussion and nobody had any. Right, yep, discussion on B and C.
Yeah.
Move me, second Tracy. Further discussion on B and C.
Well, funnily enough, I've got something to say.
Could be one.
I can't accept that there's anything in that report that we've got or in the policy that actually prevents the staging, removal of wine ponds. Well, that's currently worded.
That's correct.
But the recommendation that you asked us to vote on says that it does.
No, the recommendation says, it says that it does not, we know that it does not permit. Correct, and then C agrees to amend the Wild Economy.
But I've just said that.
I see your point.
Yes, how can I agree with that? It doesn't say that at all.
I agree.
It's, but the report writer even told me that it doesn't say that.
Agrees that the Wild and Conifer Control Policy agrees that the objective of the Wild and Conifer Control.
Well, if you're looking for amendments to your motion, I can give you a better one.
Go on.
No, I think that's the quandary.
It's not clear in what it actually.
Well, it is clear what's been recommended, and if you want to change it, you can, and my logic still remains, is that the policy is currently is filed, and that's the issue I've got.
So if B was amended, and thank you for pointing this out, if B is amended to agrees that staging is not permitted under the Wild and Conifer Control Policy. The staging, the removal of wild and conifers from council-owned or managed land is not permitted under the Wild and Conifer Control Policy. That resolves that issue.
Well, it's not, you have to convince me.
No,
sorry.
Right.
And I was saying, because my answer's going to be no, because the current policy is silent on staging.
Good point. The lawyer should spot that. So slower. So I, with Tracy's agreement, move that B changes to agrees that the staged removal of wild and conifers from council-owned or managed land is not permitted under the wild and conifer control policy, then C would remain the same.
Will it be agrees or advises that? Because to Neil's point, we're not agreeing because he believes that it's not in the policy.
It will be in the policy then though, because C will put it in the policy.
Agreed to amend the control policy.
So B will make it very clear that if we vote in favour of B, staging won't be allowed and C will actually write that. Whereas quite rightly, as Neil points out, B is not suitable. Now, Neil, are you shaking your head because there's something that's clear and you don't agree with it?
No, it still doesn't solve the problem. It still says the same thing.
The word agrees, I think.
Yeah.
Because agrees that
Yeah.
that's what the policy.
This council,
Can't agree and then.
this council prepared to agree that the policy says that when it's signed on it, and the report writer told you it's signed on it.
Okay.
Sorry, it's
What word would you use?
That's right.
Lewis.
But while in policy, conifer policy does not permit staging.
Right. Yes.
You amend the policy.
So the objective of the policy is the eradication of wildland finds. I think the interpretation from staff here is because that is the objective, staging is not permitted. So we could shift it to agrees that the objective of the wild and conifer policy is the eradication of wildland finds, and therefore staging would not be permitted.
Or in B, we could simply say, instead of agrees, resolves that the stage removal of wild and conifers is not permitted on council owned or managed land.
Remove it.
Well, I'm waiting to see whether Neil, because he has raised a very valid point here.
It's not for me to agree. Because
No,
I'm wrong with that. If the council makes that decision, I've asked it on what basis, because the policy doesn't say that. That's.
But we will be putting that in the policy. That's what ceases. So we are changing the policy. We're adding to the policy.
Won't change how I'm going to vote.
I know that. That's not the issue.
So it's not for me to say, well, it's right or wrong.
Right. Those results your.
That makes more sense.
Okay, sorry. Last word.
I would clarification of the word stages, because is that, if this motion as presented passes, does that mean that all areas, all wild and fine within the CODC district need to be removed?
On our land.
On our land.
On our land.
Council land, council owned land. Pioneer Parks, please.
Sorry, quiet. Nigel's asked a question. Thank you.
Right, if you're not going to allow staging, that means that every wild and fine that's on CODC land in the district needs to be removed.
Through the process of the wild and conifer control group that's in the recent.
Yes, well, that's staging.
In its own. As time allows. Because you won't come down the same day.
Respond to Nigel perhaps. We have worked with the Central Otago Wild and Conifer Control Group to identify those priority areas that should be eradicated first because of things like the propensity for seed spread. And that's, you could argue that as staging, but there are some areas that are of more risk than others. What we are meaning by staging in this context, and we can write this very specifically into the amendment if it goes through, is that when a priority area is identified for eradication, that site is not staged.
Well, that's just.
So does it need to say individual sites?
Within a specified site.
In this, we could start to build that clarity.
Well, results that the stage removal of wild and conifers within an individual identified site is not permitted.
Oh, really, really on sophistry, isn't it? Just the way you describe it as staging. I mean, really.
Now, the reality is, the trees have got to come out. And as soon as it's become an issue, basically in the urban part of town, we started tricking around with questions.
That's fine. Once you start talking in absolutes, you build tracks for yourself.
I'm going to pause both you guys because we're going back. We're trying to get the wording right there. We're going back into the substantive argument. So the stage removal of wild and conifers in individual identified sites. And then that's clear enough for the wordsmiths to actually put in under C. where it's required to reflect that decision. So we know what we're doing. Yeah, so Half Mile, Boot Hill, Alexander Airport, Sugarloaf.
And individual impact.
Or with them?
Within.
Yeah.
Marvelous. Okay, so look, we've got the words closer. We know what we're doing here. We're saying that if this passes, then there's the chop goes, once it's identified, then it gets done. Tracy, you seconded that. I'm happy to move that amendment. You're happy to second it. Thank you. Further discussion?
Yeah, you've got some new words.
Yes.
I just think that the effort you had to go to get those words to suit a policy that was put together pretty quickly shows that the issue is bigger than just this potentially. And I guess if we go down that path there, I think you've still enabling a staged approach, because that's what's happening regardless, because funding says it's staged.
Site by site and stage.
The policy is a guide for how council, just read the words a moment ago. Provide guidance on council's approach to managing wild and conflict on council owned and managed land. No matter, that's all it can do, that's all it does. No matter what you say now, the work program of the central program of wild and conflict control and the budget of this council says it's staged already. No matter how you do it, or anything else, it is staged. And we're in a situation here where we're making some resolutions or proposing some resolutions that are going to say staging is not allowed effectively, and we're still going to do it. And I just don't see why we do it.
But it's staged site by site.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I've got your answer. It doesn't satisfy me.
Tracy, get your hand up.
Yeah, I just feel like we as a council are being a little bit hypocritical, that we are now picking and choosing what government policies we are going to play with. When we've heard already today that there's been some pretty big significant policies that we are following to the letter, despite the community saying, actually, no, we don't want that. But we have around this table have continued to progress with a policy from central government, and now there's a policy out there, and we're now choosing to pick and choose how we deal with it. So I just feel quite strongly with that.
But who are we representing here? I mean, the Warring Pine group is the only group that's making the decision. Council-owned land is ultimately owned by the ratepayers. Do the ratepayers not have any say in special places that they would like to protect?
There are the ratepayers that actually want the pines gone. They're not just in individual sites. Yes, of course, I understand, but we're a district. And from a district perspective,
I think it's difficult too, Tracy, when you've got another national policy that comes out that says smart pine trees.
Roxburgh.
All right, anybody else?
And please don't take anything I've said to think that I don't think the pine tree should come down. It's not about that. It's about doing it properly and getting a policy that actually works for us. And I'm not convinced of it.
And I think there's confusion, and I've sort of picked that up today, is site by site, total eradication, you go in there. Having a very flimsy discussion as the group that speaks the loudest, their trees might be the latest, and whether people felt that they're going to go 50% of the trees to make it look okay until the end. I mean, my aim is side by side, or I think stage might be the percentage of the trees to make this softening of the process. They're not just we've got a policy, same as anything else.
I'm starting to hear the same thing coming back. And I think that we could do that for another couple of hours, you know, I don't think there's a lot of profit in that. So I'm going to, Tracy and I've moved B and C, I've moved and Tracy seconded it. It's time to come to a vote. I'm going to do it by a show of hands. All those in favour of B and C as they are on board, please raise your hand. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Those against? 2, 3. Oh, goody. So just keep that against, hands up. Okay. Okay. So have this properly recorded.
So what happens now?
Oh, that's easy. So just to clarify, that's 6 each?
Let me just, one moment. Just make sure we get it right. Can count to 6.
I do it up.
Yeah, I think I forget that.
6 each?
Yep, so I've got, in favour, you, Sally, Cheryl, Sarah, Tracy, Stu, is that correct? It's got 2 votes.
Yep.
Against, Taylor, Neil, Ian, and Nigel Martin. Is that correct? Correct. Okay, yeah, cool.
So the vote
Yes.
is tied under standing order 19.3, the chairperson has a casting vote when there's an equality of votes.
Yes.
Yes, the chairperson.
Yep.
So my casting vote is that there's no staging of the wild and pines policy. That wording will be corrected. I also think staff need to have a consideration about bringing this policy back in terms of what Neil raised.
Yeah.
We're considering. Thank you. Lunchtime, thank you. That was an interesting discussion. So we had scheduled a 40-minute lunch break, so we'll be back here at 25 minutes to. How's the maths? Yeah, 25 minutes to.